Italy was the one country in Europe which was a part of the BRI. They're pulling out. So that's just not just one country. That's a very important country because they could have brought others into the fold and they instead are choosing to go out. So I have lots of questions, but Samir wants to make a quick interjection. So Samir, Saran, go for it.
Quick point. I think broadly, I think Kishor would perhaps be correct in many assessments. But let me just tell you that numbers don't work that way. In the next 14 to 15 years, if India is going to be 18, 17 or 18 or 19 trillion dollars, it would not mean that the Chinese would have moved from where they are today. The whole basis of countries catching up is that at some point you start stagnating. And the big China question is that have they reached that point where they are now plateauing and stagnating? We have seen Japan and many others experience this for decades, this stagnation. So 85 years, I think, maybe pushing it too far. I would certainly agree with Ian and others if we were to talk about a decade and a half, the time where the difference would be significantly reduced, or rather would be insignificant in its implications. So that's one part. But second point, very quickly, again, it's not about the 140 or 130 who arrive at Emperor Xi's court. Who are they? And that is important. And the minute many of them have an alternative to the BRI, which was not available till now, many of them will not come to the court. They went to the court because the Chinese were the only game in town. They were the only ones who were investing in the infrastructure and other industrial aspirations of developing countries. My whole point that I made in my opening remarks was that if rich countries with partners like Brazil, India and others, if we can reach out and if we can build the futures of those who seek a better life, BRI will have competition. BRI is the only game in town. Even if it is a bad one, people are playing it. Get better ones on the board and you will see many desert the BRI. That's the point I'm making, Rahul.
So you've said a couple of things, and I want to build on the question of what happens in China next. Okay, go for it. I like this. It's sounding like a good verbal joust. So go for it, Kishor Mahbubani. Yeah, go for it. Go.
No, I don't disagree with the points that Samir has made. But at the end of the day, he may be right that China's growth has plateaued, and India will therefore catch up much faster. But I have over the last 30 years been watching China. I have heard about the death of China every decade. Unfortunately, decade after decade, all the people who predict the growth of that the growth of China has ended have failed in their predictions, and so we'll find out. In any case, we'll find out. This year is 2023. We'll find out in 2033 whether or not China's growth has plateaued. And I always believe that you don't plan again, your best case scenarios that China has collapsed. You plan against the worst case scenarios that China may be growing very fast again. And on the question of Italy, let me give you one statistic that was, we are still so obsessed with the Europeans. Italy, frankly, Italy's economy is declining. And over the last, let me ask you a simple question. The European Union has a $17 trillion GNP. ASEAN, where I come from, Southeast Asia, has a $3 trillion GNP. From the years 2010 to 2020, who added more to global economic growth? Was it the European Union or was it ASEAN?
I got to jump in here.
ASEAN added more to global economic growth than the European Union. So why are we so fixated on the Europeans?
Okay. Let me put that question to Ian Bremmer, because I spoke to Dr. Geeta Gopinath just a couple of hours before we did this recording, and she said that China will continue to grow. One is the aspect of stagnation, the other is the concern about decline. Far from the IMF's current assessment seems to be that China, despite what's happening with debt, despite what's happening in the real estate sector, will continue to grow. So Ian Bremmer, where do you come out on the question of stagnation, decline, or continuing growth?
Look, I think that I agree with Kishor that it's too early to talk about things like peak China and stagnation. That seems to be an ideologically freighted sort of discussion that's mostly had by people that really want China to fall apart. It's too early to make that assessment. But Italy matters. Italy matters a lot. And you saw how excited and how proud the Chinese were when the Italians said that they were going to join BRI. Why? Because it was the first G7 country to do so. It's a part of Europe. It meant that the Chinese were having success in ensuring that the Europeans weren't just going to be pro-US, but we're going to balance between the Americans and the Chinese would do both. The Chinese wouldn't be contained. They wouldn't be ganged up on. We saw the same thing with the Chinese and the 16+1, which then expanded. The East Europeans, the South Europeans, which became much weaker and fell apart when the Chinese were supporting Russia right before the invasion of Ukraine. So the Europeans as a whole are looking much more aligned with the United States on China. Ursula von der Leyen talking about de-risking as opposed to decoupling, the exact same formulation that Biden has. Why? Because they both formulated it together. So that's why Italy is so important for China, not because the Italian economy or because the Italian prime minister matters, because it's symptomatic of a bigger problem that the Chinese are presently experiencing, some of which is their own fault, some of which is politicized from the West. Now, I think that the exciting thing here is not whether or not China falls apart. In the same way that people have been saying that China is going to collapse for decades, people have been talking about the coming Chinese century for decades now, too. And that's gone. What we are seeing with the BRICS, with the G7, and most importantly with the G20 is a recognition that no country is going to own the 21st century. We have global challenges like pandemics, like climate change, like disruptive technologies, like the absence of adequate development finance and the challenges of globalization. And in order to address those challenges, it must be done multilaterally. It must be done globally. The Americans, the Chinese, the Indians, the Japanese, the EU must participate, and the African Union needs to be a part of the conversation. And the G20 imperfectly, nonetheless, represents a significant positive step in the recognition of that. This is not a win primarily for India or the US. It's not a loss primarily for China. It is rather a step on the road to recognizing that 10 billion people on this planet by 2100 are only going to succeed if the G20 as an organization becomes more successful.